The year was 1425. The air in Domremy was quiet, save for the wind rushing through the wheat fields. A 13-year-old girl named Jeanne, daughter of Jacques d'Arc, walked barefoot through the golden crops. She wasn't like the others. Her eyes carried storms, silent but ready. The English had seized half of France. War was everywhere, yet hope nowhere. Joan's home was modest. Her father was a farmer, her mother a pious woman who taught her to pray. She never learned to read, but she absorbed the scriptures like rain to soil. At night, while the town slumbered, Joan would kneel in the hayloft and whisper prayers to the Virgin Mary. She had no idea that heaven had already heard her. It began at midday. The bells of the village chapel had just rung when she heard it, clearer than any dream. A voice, not from the world of men. "Joan, the Lord has chosen you." She dropped the bucket she was carrying. Around her, nothing moved. Not the birds, not the leaves. It was as if time paused. The voice was followed by a shimmer of light, and standing within it, saints. Michael, Margaret, and Catherine. Her heart pounded, not in fear, but in awe. "France is dying," said the voice. "You must rise." How could a girl from a forgotten village be chosen for war? It sounded mad, but Joan didn't doubt. Something within her had awakened. Days passed. The voices returned, stronger, more urgent. Her mission was clear. She must go to Charles, the Dauphin of France. She must lead his armies and drive the English out. At 16, Joan cut her hair short. She wore a man's tunic and trousers, blasphemy to some, prophecy to others. Her neighbors whispered, called her possessed. But when Burgundian raiders attacked Domremy, Joan's warnings saved her village. Even skeptics began to wonder. She left her home in secret, guided by the visions. Traveling through war-torn lands, crossing rivers and enemy lines, she reached the castle of Vaucouleurs. There, she met the garrison captain, Robert de Baudricourt. He laughed. "A girl? Led an army? You'd best marry and keep hens." But Joan stood firm, eyes locked on his. "I do not come from myself. I come from God." It wasn't her courage that convinced him. It was her certainty. She spoke of the Dauphin's secret prayer, a prayer no one else could have known. Baudricourt turned pale. Within days, she was on horseback, armored in chainmail, heading toward Chinon, the stronghold of Charles VII. By now, the myth of the Maid of Lorraine was spreading. A peasant girl claiming to be chosen by heaven? A girl who knew hidden things? France was watching. Some hoped, others feared. When she entered the castle, Charles disguised himself among his nobles to test her. She walked past kings and courtiers and knelt before the true Dauphin without hesitation. "You are he whom God has called," she said, "and I am she who must lead you." The court gasped. And so began the rise of the girl who would change the fate of France forever. Under the torchlight, borrowed and ill-fitting, but it wasn't steel that gave her strength. It was her conviction. The Dauphin, Charles VII, was desperate. France had lost Orléans, the gateway to the south. The English siege tightened each day, and morale among his soldiers was crumbling. But here stood Joan, a mere girl, claiming that God had sent her to lift the siege and crown him king at Reims. The church demanded a trial to test her purity. She was interrogated by bishops and scholars, accused of heresy and witchcraft. Yet she answered every question with grace beyond her years. One priest whispered to another, "If this girl is not sent by God, then God has never spoken." She passed every test, and so, reluctantly, but with no other hope, Charles granted her command. They gave her a white banner embroidered with lilies, and the names Jesus Maria sewn in gold thread. She refused to bear a sword until, through her visions, she located an ancient blade buried behind the altar of a forgotten chapel. It was there, rusted, yet intact. "This is the sword," she said. "I will not kill with it, only raise it high." When she entered Orléans, the people wept. A crowd surged around her, reaching out as if touching her would heal the land. Soldiers who had long forgotten courage now stood taller. Hope had returned, on horseback, wearing armor, and speaking of angels. The siege of Orléans had dragged on for months. The English believed themselves untouchable. They laughed when they heard of the Maid, a girl with no military training. What could she do? But they hadn't counted on what Joan stirred in the hearts of men. She rode with the banner, not the sword. She prayed before each battle and made her soldiers confess and take communion. She refused swearing, looting, and sin in her camp. She was no ordinary leader. She was a living fire. The attacks came swift and unexpected. Joan led the charge on the fortress of St. Louis. Arrows flew, blood soaked the fields. But Joan remained at the front, undaunted. A soldier near her was struck down. She dismounted, lifted him, and whispered a prayer. By nightfall, the French had reclaimed the fort. Victory. Then came the Tourelles, the English stronghold on the Loire. The final barrier. Joan charged the gate, her banner fluttering like a divine wind. Mid-battle, she was struck by an arrow to the shoulder and fell. The soldiers panicked, their spirit fractured. But Joan stood again. Bleeding, pale, she raised her banner once more and shouted, "Do not flee, for they are yours! The day is yours! France is yours!" And the men surged forward like lions. The fortress fell. The English, shocked, defeated, retreated. The siege of Orléans was broken. France rejoiced, and in every home, every whisper, one name bloomed like a flame: Jeanne la Pucelle, Joan the Maid. Joan of Arc, Orleans, had been delivered. The news spread like wildfire through France. Town criers shouted in disbelief, priests wept from the pulpits, and villagers lit candles in silent awe. The impossible had happened. A girl, untrained in war, had succeeded where veteran generals had failed. But Joan wasn't finished. She turned to Charles, her eyes filled with divine certainty. "You must go to Reims," she said, "and be crowned King of France, as God commands." It was madness. Reims lay deep in enemy territory, surrounded by English garrisons and towns loyal to Burgundy. To march there would be suicide. But Joan wasn't planning a battle. She was planning a pilgrimage. One by one, the towns along the route began to surrender, not through bloodshed, but through awe. The gates of Troyes opened without resistance. People greeted Joan as if she were a prophet. Children waved lilies, old men knelt, and women touched her horse's hooves for blessing. Joan had become more than a warrior. She was a symbol, a miracle. On July 16, 1429, Charles and Joan arrived at the Cathedral of Reims. The air was heavy with incense. The great bells rang out. Inside, sunlight poured through stained glass windows onto the cold stone floor, painting Joan's armor in divine colors. She stood beside the altar, white banner in hand, as the Dauphin was crowned King Charles VII. As the golden crown touched his brow, the crowd erupted into tears and hymns. Yet among them, Joan's own eyes filled with something deeper than joy. "Gentle King," she whispered, "now is fulfilled what God has promised." But her voice trembled. because Joan knew her journey would not end in rhymes. That night, in the quiet of the royal chamber, Charles knelt before her, not as a king to a peasant, but as a man before destiny. "What would you have, Joan?" he asked. She could have asked for gold, for land, for nobility, but she only said, "Let me go home, to my mother's arms." But France wouldn't let her go, nor would heaven. The voices returned, but they were more sorrowful now. They spoke of darkness ahead, of betrayal, of fire. Joan didn't flinch. She had never fought for glory. She had never asked for reward. She had only ever asked for one thing: that France might live. The coronation had been a miracle. The streets of France buzzed with Joan's name like a sacred hymn. But even miracles cast long shadows. For King Charles VII, the crown was enough. For Joan, it wasn't. "Paris must be taken," she said. "We must finish what we started." But Charles hesitated. Politics whispered louder than God in his ear now. He had begun to fear her faith, her fire, her fame. The maid was no longer just a servant of the crown. She had become something more, a legend, a threat. Still, Joan marched on. With a small army, she laid siege to Paris. But without full royal support, the campaign was doomed. Joan led the charge herself, as always. She took an arrow to the thigh, her blood staining the muddy banks of the Seine. Still, she refused to leave the field until her men dragged her away, weeping, not from pain, but from failure. Paris was within our grasp. She stayed in battle, moving from town to town, still wearing her armor, still chasing the mission the voices had given her. But the tides were changing. In 1430, outside the walls of Compiègne, her luck ran dry. As Burgundian forces surrounded her, she held the rear, covering the retreat of her men. Her horse was pulled down. She was captured, and the gates of the city were shut. Joan was left outside, alone. The villagers watched from the battlements in horror. The angel who had delivered them was now dragged in chains. She was sold to the English. And thus began the final chapter of her holy war. Imprisoned in Rouen, no armor, no banner, no friends, only cold stone walls and the silence of heaven. The English didn't want to kill Joan of Arc, the warrior. They wanted to unmake her. They put her on trial, not for crimes of war, but for heresy, for wearing men's clothes, for claiming divine visions, for rising above her station. 70 charges were brought against her. She stood alone. No legal counsel, no family, just her voice and her faith. One inquisitor asked, "Are you in the grace of God?" It was a trap. A yes would be arrogance. A no would be guilt. Joan smiled gently, eyes raised to the vaulted ceiling. "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me so." Even her accusers sat silent, but the outcome had already been written, not in heaven, but in ink. She was found guilty. Her punishment, death by fire, May 30th, 1431. Rouen, the city of judgment. At dawn, the sky was gray with mist. Damp fog clung to the wooden beams of the old marketplace. Soldiers lined the square, forming a tight circle. Priests stood with open Bibles. Townsfolk whispered among themselves, many unable to meet each other's eyes. The tension was not just fear, it was guilt. In the center stood a wooden scaffold, piled high with straw and bound logs. And on it, Joan of Arc. She was only 19. Her hair had been roughly cut. She wore a simple gray tunic. Chains shackled her ankles and wrists, but there was no trembling in her limbs. Only her lips moved, whispering prayers to the Virgin, to Saint Michael, to the voices that had once filled her with light. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. The English executioners avoided her gaze. Even they, hardened by war, feared her. Some believed she had truly been sent by heaven, and that to kill her was to strike down a holy flame. A priest offered her a cross. She kissed it gently.
"Hold it high," she whispered, "so I may see it through the smoke."
They tied her to the post. The bishop read aloud the sentence. The wind caught his words and scattered them, but the crowd didn't need to hear them. They already knew what was coming. The torch was lit. It was done not with anger, but with hesitation, because even her enemies knew they were not burning a girl, they were burning a symbol. The fire rose, smoke curled around her, flames licked at her feet, and still her voice rose above it all. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. A soldier wept openly. Another turned away. The silence of the crowd was louder than thunder. As the flames reached her chest, she cried out once more, "My voices were from God. My mission was from God. I did nothing but obey." And then stillness. The fire continued until there was nothing left but ash and the faint scent of burned roses. But Joan's light did not die. One of the English commanders, watching from the shadows, turned to his men and said, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." They scattered her ashes in the Seine, hoping to erase her memory. But you cannot drown faith. You cannot silence truth. You cannot kill a flame that was lit by heaven. The fire had turned to ash. The crowd dispersed. The soldiers marched away. But something lingered in the square that day. Not smoke, but silence. The kind of silence that only follows the death of something holy. For years, the world tried to forget Joan of Arc. Kings changed, battles faded, borders shifted. But her story, her voice, would not be buried. 25 years after her execution, an investigation was launched. Eyewitnesses came forward, not enemies, but the very ones who condemned her. Priests who once accused her wept as they confessed, "We were wrong. She was innocent. She was pure." One bishop, trembling, said, "I burned the holiest woman I have ever met." In 1456, the church overturned her verdict. She was cleared of all charges. But history had already vindicated her. Because Joan's death had not destroyed France, it had rebirthed it. Her courage ignited the hearts of peasants and kings alike. Within years of her martyrdom, the English were driven from French soil. Charles VII ruled a unified France, crowned, as Joan had promised. But he never returned to her memory. He never visited her grave. The guilt of silence weighed on him more heavily than any crown. Centuries passed. And then, something extraordinary happened. In 1909, Joan of Arc was beatified by the Catholic Church. And in 1920, 489 years after her death, she was declared a saint. A peasant girl, a warrior, a visionary, a martyr. Saint Joan of Arc. Her feast is celebrated on May 30th, the same day she was burned. Not in mourning, but in celebration of the light she brought to a dark world. Today, her statue stands in Paris, sword raised, eyes toward heaven. In Domremy, her village, pilgrims still kneel in prayer. In cathedrals, her banner hangs among kings, and in hearts across the world, she remains a symbol of what it means to listen to your soul, to fight with faith, to die with purpose, and to live forever.